session is going to be on a similar topic. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can get the information of our next presenter. Here, are you guys able to see the screen okay?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so at this point in time, I would like to introduce Dr. Katherine Strunk, and I want to make sure we get this recorded. Get going. Dr. Strunk is a MSU professor of educational policy, faculty director of EPIC, and is the president-elect of the Association of Education Finance and Policy. She has a great deal of experience. She's been an expert on K-12 educational governance. She's worked with teacher union, collective bargaining agreements, teacher labor markets. She's published in a number of peer-reviewed journals and conducted many policy briefs. She's also worked with state policymakers, district policymakers, both in Michigan and in California. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Strunk.
Thank you. And thank you so much for asking me to come today. I'm going to share my screen. I think a year into this, I would know how to do this faster. Okay, can you all see the, perfect, okay. So I was just going to share with you today some of the research EPIC has been doing about how Michigan has been educating its students throughout the pandemic. It seems to be the topic of everyone these days. And if you have questions, you should feel free to stop and ask, or we can stop at the end and make sure we try to have time. So, okay. We're going to talk about 3 different questions today. The first is, how did districts plan to offer instruction during the 2021 school year, and how did that change over the course of the year? We did conduct a survey of teachers and principals in Michigan this fall, and so I'll give you some results from that. And then we'll also talk about a study that we did looking at the extent that in-person schooling contributed to the spread of COVID-19 in Michigan schools and communities in the fall. Okay, so the first question again has to do with the instruction modalities that districts used over the course of the year. I don't know if all of you have seen these reports. We've been putting them out every month at EPIC. For those of you who don't know, EPIC is the state strategic research partner regarding education policy. We are very fortunate to have a close working relationship with MDE and CEPI. And together, the 3 institutions, we put together a survey, the Extended COVID Learning Plan Survey, that asks districts every month to upload information about their plans for instruction for that month. And so by the 2nd Tuesday, I believe, of each month, every district is supposed to write back into the survey that's operated through MDE about how they're planning on giving kids instruction. We ask about instruction modality, so by each grade level, K through 12, by special populations. We ask them to approximate the proportion of students that are learning in each modality within buckets, so at 0, 1 to 24%, 25 to 49%, and so on. We ask about the proportion of their time in remote learning that is synchronous versus asynchronous, and similarly for hybrid instruction, the days of in-person instruction per week and the approximate proportion of the remote instructional time that's synchronous versus asynchronous. And we also ask a number of questions around additional resources and support. So just how we define instruction modality. We do it in 5 sort of mutually exclusive categories. First is fully in-person only. These are the districts that are operating almost business as normal. They're in person 5 days a week with their students, and this is the only option that students are given, is to be back in the schools. Then there's the opposite, which is the fully remote only districts. These are the ones that have been operating in each month completely remotely. No students or very few or no general ed students are back in the schools. Then there's the hybrid only. These are the school districts that are operating with some mornings or some days a week. Kids are learning in person and sometimes they're learning remotely. And then there's the districts that kind of offer more than one option. And so if they're offering fully in person and remote and hybrid, we qualify them as a fully in person option. And if they're offering students the option to be hybrid or fully remote, we're calling them a hybrid option. So here's how you can see plans in March. The data from April just came in, I think on Friday night last week. So we'll be putting out a report on Monday with April data updated, but this is the most recent we currently have. And you'll see what happened in March. So I have on the left school districts and on the right students. And you can see by March, the far majority of districts were at least offering some version of in-person instruction. Only 7% of districts left. And by the way, I should say these are traditional public school districts and public school charter districts. We don't include in these the districts that weren't required to submit e-call plans by the legislation. These are the ones that were already fully virtual before the pandemic. So you can see that 7% of TPS and PSA districts were fully remote in March. This represents about 4% of students in the state. By contrast, 69% of districts by March were offering a fully in-person option, and that represents 66% of students in the state. Here's how it changed over time. It's hard to actually tell from the actual numbers here, so I'll show you the graphic. So here's how we see the kind of evolution over the course of the school year. You can see in September and October, the greens are the fully in-person. The Kelly green is with the option. You see very few districts required students to be in person over the course of the school year. The purples are the fully remote only. These are the ones that only offered remote instruction to their students. And you can see, in September, there was about, someplace over 60% offering basically fully in-person instruction, which is a little bit counter to the media narrative. And then you see, in October, November, that ticked up a little bit. But then in December, with the second wave, we saw that go back down substantially to fewer than 50% of districts were offering fully in-person instruction. And again, as the governor and President Biden started to push districts to go back in person, you see that creeping up over time, January, February, and March. Here's how it looked across the state. These are just traditional public school districts, and charter school districts don't have geographic boundaries. And so you can see how this evolved. In September, this was mostly the urban areas that were remote in purple, as those dropped down in October and November. But then in December, you see, pretty wide swath around the state going back to fully remote. And then again, it started to decrease mostly in the urban areas over time. Here's how it looks when you look at districts by the proportion of economically disadvantaged students that they serve. And so the top panel, we see the proportion of districts that have, we see the bottom quartile of districts that serve the lowest proportion of economically disadvantaged students. These are the wealthiest districts serving the wealthiest students relatively. The bottom panel are the top quartile of districts that serve the highest proportion of economically disadvantaged students. And I think the patterns are pretty clear. They follow the same pattern as the overall that we saw on the last slide, but at every point of the school year, districts with fewer low-income students are more likely to offer in-person instruction and less likely to offer only remote instruction. And by contrast, districts with the most poor students are less likely to offer in-person instruction and far more likely to only offer remote instruction. So this presents a different opportunity to learn in person depending on the kinds of kids who are in the district. Here we also show this by proportion of Black students, the same thing. We separate the districts by quartile, and then the top panel is the districts with the lowest proportion of Black students. The bottom panel is the districts with the greatest proportion of Black students. We leave out the middle two quartiles here, just for sake of getting it onto one slide. And you can see the exact same patterns as the last slide, just even more accentuated. And so this tells us that districts with the greatest proportion of Black students were the least likely to offer in-person instruction and the most likely to offer remote instruction throughout the school year. I should note that this also follows urban, rural, suburban patterns. Urban districts were the most likely to offer remote instruction and least likely to offer in-person, and rural districts were the most likely to flip and offer in-person instruction. And this has to do with many things. This is not a regression. This is simply just showing you the patterns. Here it is by students. So we weight the district size, the districts by size, so we can sort of see the proportion of students that were offered each instruction modality. It follows the same pattern. It's important to look at this though, because here we're transitioning into looking at the proportion of students that we think are learning in each instruction modality as opposed to being offered. So again, we asked districts to tell us in ranges and buckets the proportion of students that they think are learning in person, remote, or in a hybrid fashion in each month. And so we can get ranges, basically, average ranges across the state. And so that's what you see here. That top panel in green is the proportion of students that districts estimate are learning fully in person over the course of the school year. So while 60-something% of districts were offering fully in person in September, you see that only between 26 and 38% of students were actually estimated to be learning fully in person. By March, as more and more districts were offering fully in-person instruction, you can see the take-up rate is higher. So between 35% and a half of the students in the state were learning in person by the district's own estimate. On the flip side, you see that even though only 7% of districts required fully remote instruction by the end of the school year by March, between about 24% and 44% of kids were still taking up the fully remote option, which suggests to us that there are a lot of students out there who continue to learn fully remotely, even if they're being offered the option to be back in person. So because, at EPIC, we're pretty interested in equity of opportunity, we wanted to understand a little bit more about differential take-up rates. This is a very busy slide. I should say that this is all online on our website. If you go to the website and look at COVID-19 research, you can get to these reports fairly easily. And so you could have a little bit longer to look at a busy graph. But what we have here is the top panel shows the proportion, it shows the kids that are learning fully in person, middle is hybrid, and the bottom is remote. We show for every single month, September through March. This is cutting it by the proportion of economically disadvantaged students in the district. So again, the green bars show us the districts at the bottom quartile. They have the fewest economically disadvantaged students. The light blue bars are the highest quartile districts. And then the medium bars are the dark blue in the middle. What you can see here is, and just kind of talk about broad patterns for a second, you can see here that if you look at the bottom row, this is fully remote. The gray in each bar shows you the proportion of kids that were offered to be fully remote. And because almost every single district at least offered the option to be fully remote, you see that it's nearly 100% the whole way through. But the difference really happens in what happens between the green and the blue bars. So let's look at March, when the fewest districts were requiring fully remote instruction. The green bar on the left of the March panel on the bottom right corner shows you that, something like almost 35% of kids between 15 and 35% of kids were learning fully remotely, even though 100% of them were offered it if they were in the wealthier districts, in the lowest quartile of economic disadvantaged students. By contrast, on the right of that panel, you see that it's more like, 60 to 80% of kids seem to be learning in person, seem to be learning remotely in the lowest income districts in the state. The flip is in the in-person on the very top right corner. You see that something between, 40 to 60% or 50 to 70% are learning in person if you're in the wealthiest districts, as opposed to 10 to 20% in the lowest income districts in the state. So not only is there a differential opportunity to learn in person or remotely, but there's also a differential take-up rate by these districts, by these kids in these districts. And this is the same for proportion of Black students. It's even more stark here. If you look at that top right corner, you can see that between 60 and 80% of kids in the districts with the lowest proportions of African-American students are learning in person, but only between 10 and 20% of the kids with the greatest proportions of African-American students are learning in person. And the flip is for the remote instruction on the very bottom right. We can return to this because I think it's critically important, but I want to make sure we have time to get through everything today. So here's just to quickly show you some of the other data from the eCall surveys. Here we look at the reported days of planned in-person instruction if students are learning in the hybrid modality by grade. We show you kindergarten, 3rd, 6th, and 9th grade because you don't see much difference across grades within levels or really across levels of schooling either. And the big takeaway here is pretty much across the school year between, and again, we ask this in ranges so we don't get very precise, but between about 2.5 and 3 1/3 days a week are learning in person if you're hybrid, and the rest is learning remotely. And that ticked up a little bit over the course of the school year, but it's pretty consistent across grade levels and across the year. Here's the same kind of idea, but this is for proportion of time for hybrid students that are learning synchronously. Remote students that are learning synchronously. And so if you're learning remotely, how much of the time is sort of feedback, live feedback with the teacher, the instructor, and how much of the time is sort of a flipped classroom or learning just from online resources or from workbooks. And what we see here, again, kindergarten, 3rd, 6th, and 9th, we don't see substantial differences across grade levels. By March, between about 30 and 51%, 31 and 51% of the time, remote students are learning synchronously, but that means between 1/2 and 2/3 of the time, remote students are learning asynchronously. This is also important because the literature shows that while flipped classrooms can work really well, we know that kids, especially little kids, need to be learning in sync with an instructor. And so if 1/2 to 2/3 of the time when they're in remote, they're not, there's concerns about how much they're able to actually understand what they're learning and ways to do that. And I'll show you some data in a minute from the surveys about teachers' concerns with remote instruction. So the key takeaways here, from us are that the far majority of districts, have planned to offer some kind of in-person learning for the majority of the school year. But the opportunities really aren't the same across the state. So, lower income Black, I didn't show you Latina, or urban students here are much less likely to have been offered the opportunity to learn in person. And there are differential take-up rates for in-person learning. So lower income Black, Latina, and urban students are less likely to opt into in-person instruction, even when it's offered. And I think we want to think about why that is. So what are the issues in those districts that are making the take-up, the offer and the take-up of in-person instruction less likely, and how will those continue into the fall, and how should we be thinking about educating our students across the state? We don't have a measure of the quality of learning experiences, whether remote, hybrid, or in person. So we can't really talk to that well, but we do know that students that are learning in a hybrid model are in person about 2.5 to 3 1/3 days a week. And students learning remotely are only spending about 1/3 to 1/2 of their time in a synchronous way. All of this tells us that students across the state have had tremendously different opportunities to learn, which has implications for how prepared they're going to be when they return to school in fall 2021. And I think we need to be thinking a lot as a state about what we're going to do to help meet every single student where they are in the fall. Okay, I know I'm going fast. Here we're going to show some data from our fall survey. I should say we also had a spring survey. Reports from both of the surveys are up on our website as well. So I'm going to do some highlights from the fall survey here. And spring of 2020. So last spring we did a survey in fall of this year as well. So the first table I'm going to show you has a lot going on. So let me just quickly walk you through it. The right panel is principals, the left panel is teachers. So in this particular question, we ask about educators' concerns about the impact of COVID-19. And the green and the blue bars are when teachers told us or principal told us they were concerned or extremely concerned. The purple and the lighter blue bars are if they're not at all or only somewhat concerned. We did have some teachers and principals who just didn't respond to given items in the survey, even if they answered the survey. So we kind of center at 0 to show you the sum of the green and blue bars to tell you kind of the extent to which there is concern or extreme concern among teachers and principals about each item. Again, these are all the items we asked about. And the key takeaway for me as I was looking at this is how many of these things you get, around 50% of teachers and principals or more are concerned about. So there's a pretty deep level of concern about the ways in which the pandemic has impacted students' learning and their well-being over the course of the last year plus. Some things that really stand out are concerns around building and maintaining relationships between teachers and students. This, we've heard from a lot of teachers and principals has been quite difficult. Similarly, there's concerns about students being impacted by grief and trauma related to COVID-19. Students falling behind in literacy and in math and other content areas, students missing instructional time, students missing opportunities for social interactions with their peers, students spending too much time on screens. As a mother of 2 third graders, I can tell you that is a concern of mine. Health and safety of students who are experiencing homelessness. There's well above 70% of principals said this was a major concern for them. And the health and safety of students who need external support services. Here we ask about teachers delivering remote instruction and how their concerns differed from, say, the concerns of teachers who are in person or who doing a mixed version of instruction. By mixed, I mean teachers who are teaching both in person and remotely, maybe in different days of the week. I think in some instances it's at the same time, which seems very hard. So here we just show you the proportion of teachers saying that they are concerned to a moderate or to a great extent about these things. The key takeaway here is that there's not tremendous differences between teachers' expressions of concerns if they're in person, remote, or in some sort of mixed fashion. But remote teachers often say that they're more concerned about things like missing services, students being impacted by grief and trauma related to COVID, and health and safety of students experiencing homelessness, and the health and safety of students who need external support services. Interestingly, the in-person teachers were just a tad bit more concerned about students falling behind in literacy and ELA and in math. My hypothesis on that, which is hard to test, is that the teachers that are teaching kids remotely, are more often in poorer districts and in urban districts and in districts with greater proportions of traditionally underserved students. They may be just more worried about the health and welfare of their students, and sort of the achievement outcomes are maybe a little secondary. Here we asked them, because we all know that technology has been such an important part of this last year for all students, whether in person or remote, frankly. We asked teachers about technology accessibility and principles about accessibility. Here we just look at the teacher responses, and we asked them if they think that if their schools provided either devices or internet to resources to students and or staff. The dark green are the devices, so these are laptops or tablets, and the Kelly green are the internet services, like free broadband access or Wi-Fi hotspots. We separate this into, again, economic disadvantaged, Black, Latinx, and urbanicity. The high is the top quartile, low is the bottom quartile, middle are the two middle quartiles. So the top panel is economic disadvantage. We can look at that first, but you can see that across the board, all teachers said that 90% of teachers said that districts are providing devices to kids and students and staff who needed them. The differences really come up in the internet, and you see teachers in urban districts, teachers in districts with high proportions of low income, Black and Latinx students are the ones that are more likely to say that their districts are providing free internet to students and staff. So even though that is good news, we did note there were several challenges with technology and remote instruction. So educators, again, this is the same, we center at 0, principals on the right, teachers on the left. And what you can see here is that educators really were concerned that there were things that were impeding students' abilities to learn remotely. Principals on the right, talked a lot about, or expressed pretty great concern about family members' abilities to help with remote learning due to the lack of content knowledge, just other responsibilities that family members have during the day, like work, and technology constraints. Teachers were particularly concerned with the ability to find instructional plans and materials that work well in a remote classroom. This was a challenge for teachers. We saw this in our spring 2020 survey as well. So we also asked about student engagement. This has been a big issue across the state, and we knew this, so we wanted to make sure we were getting at it. So we asked about difficulty maintaining engagement, maintaining attendance, and locating students. You see, so the green is maintaining engagement, the dark blue is attendance, and the lighter blue is locating students. The bottom is the proportion of teachers reporting difficulties with student engagement in each of those 3 areas. The top panel is overall, and you can see, something around 70% of teachers said that it was difficult to maintain engagement. Only about 40% said that it was difficult to locate students, and somewhere in the middle, around 50% said it was difficult to maintain attendance. But then if you split it by in-person, mixed, and remote teachers, so that's modality in that middle panel, you see that in-person teachers were less likely to say it was hard to maintain engagement than mixed and remote teachers. And they were less likely to have a difficulty locating students than were mixed and remote teachers. when you look at teachers who taught in high economic disadvantaged districts versus low disadvantaged districts, you see sort of in the blue lines a pretty clear linear relationship. So districts that were in the most disadvantaged districts, teachers that were in the most disadvantaged districts said they had greater difficulty maintaining attendance and locating students relative to teachers in districts in the lowest economically disadvantaged districts with the fewest poor students. We did ask about the professional development that teachers received, given all the concerns they had expressed. Teachers told us that they found PD that was focused on the technology aspects of the year most helpful. So I should say that this is a difficult to read graph again. We have a lot of data. We tried to squeeze into little bits of figures. So we asked teachers to tell us if they got a PD at all, and that's what the colored bars are here. And then if they did get, and that it's great, so they said they didn't get it or they didn't respond. If they thought it was a useful PD, that's the green and the dark blue, useful and extremely useful. If they thought it was only somewhat useful or not at all useful, that's the blue and the lighter blue and the purple. So you can see that, 2/3 of teachers said they got PD on specific learning management systems and platforms, and the majority of those thought that that was useful. Maybe a little bit different in terms of things like best practices for delivering instruction in a remote setting, where you can see again, about half the teachers got that, but very few of them, relatively, less than 25% of teachers found that to be at all useful. We are also interested, again, since we focus a lot on thinking about equity at EPIC, we are worried a lot about special education services provided to kids during the pandemic. So we asked educators to tell us their concerns about the effect of the pandemic on the provision of special ed services. We asked them in terms of, do you think that the pandemic had a major negative impact, a somewhat negative impact, no change, a somewhat positive, or a major positive impact on the provision of all these different services? The dark blue and purple on the left of the 0% lines are the major negative and somewhat negative impact. The bright blue is the no change. So you can see that for principals, many felt that there was no change provision of services, but both principals and teachers, the majority of the ones that answered, said that they thought that there had been a negative impact on services. In particular, the negative impact seemed to be ability to implement the district's MTSS to ensure students receive necessary services, and really the overall ability to provide a free and appropriate public education to all students. Here we break that out by the kind of teaching that a teacher was doing, whether it was fully in person or mixed or fully remote. Fully in person is green, fully remote is purple, mixed is the blue. And the key takeaway here is for all of these services that we asked about, in-person teachers were less likely to report that the pandemic had negatively impacted special ed services, and mixed and remote teachers were more likely. We did ask teachers about would they be willing to return in person. Remember, this was again in the fall. And I think the key takeaway here for us is that teachers really wanted to go back to school in person if they felt, mostly because they felt like it was hard for their students to be remote. And again, we show this by fully in person, mixed, and fully remote. And I think the takeaway for us here was that it didn't differ hugely. There's not a lot of patterns about the differences between teachers who were in person, mixed, and remote. Most of them just felt like, if you look at that bottom, 40% of teachers told us that they wanted to go back because the potential impact on learning for all students. Somewhere around 35 to 40% of teachers told us across the board, told us the potential impact of learning for students with IEP and 504 plans was a big reason why they wanted to come back to school. Interestingly, and we found this in other research in other areas as well, very few teachers responded that changes in the spread of COVID-19 in their community was affecting their decision to go back to in-person school. Okay, this is the last survey question I'm going to show you. I don't want to. So we just asked about what are you going to do next year? This was from the fall, and we found that way more teachers than principals said that they were considering leaving the teaching profession, leaving their school, leaving their district. And it's closing in on 50% of teachers said that they had at least somewhat considered leaving the teaching profession. About 40%, 35% of teachers said they considered leaving their school or their district. The green lines, though, show you that relatively few of them actually sought out other options. Okay. Last, I'm going to show you some results from some analysis we did. We did this in Michigan and in Washington. I'll show you the Michigan results to the extent that in-person schooling contributes to the spread of COVID-19. Because I'm running low on time, I'm just going to kind of quickly say, you're all researchers, so you understand all of this, that it's really hard to do just a raw correlation of whether or not there's COVID spread coming in the communities because of schools in person, because obviously there's other factors like mask wearing, compliance with social distancing and mitigation measures, political factors that could cause both COVID to rise in the community and schools to be open in person. And so we want to try to net out all those characteristics so that we can actually get at the actual relationship. So we predict county level COVID cases, 7-day average in month T+1 based on the modality, all that you just saw of the modality data in month T. We do it for both just districts offer and then the proportion of students estimated to take up that offer. And we control for a host of variables like physical, demographic, and survey measures that are controlling for virality, mask wearing, because a lot of data have shown that more Republican counties were more likely to go back in person. We control for Trump 2016 vote share, proportion of school-age kids in the county, just a plethora of things. We do a series of regressions on this. We also have different outcomes to measure if we're doing something with a functional form, which we think we're good. We look at district effects models as well, but those are less precise. So I'm going to just show you the results. So what you see here on the bottom x-axis is the prior COVID cases. So of course, we want to make sure that we're modeling the rate of growth of COVID independent of schools reopening. So on the right-hand side, on the bottom x-axis, we have prior COVID cases. We measure this as a square. So prior COVID cases in month T-1, and then the square of that as well. COVID cases on the y-axis are COVID cases in month T+1, the first week of month T+1. And this is the relationship, kind of the marginal probabilities. This is the marginal relationship between being back in person fully in Michigan, district that were back in person fully in Michigan in the fall, and increase in COVID rates in the county. So you can see the 95% intervals around confidence intervals around the red line, which is the relationship, and the actual coefficient. And we put in here also the percentile in the distribution at the time of COVID cases in the county, so you can see how far out of sample we are and are not predicting. The main takeaway here is at pretty low to moderate levels of COVID in surrounding counties and the surrounding county, we don't actually see that being back in person significantly contributes to COVID spread. However, when you get to around 21 cases per 100,000 in the surrounding county, and you open up your schools in person fully, you do see a significant effect on COVID spread in the surrounding county in later weeks and months. It's small, it's something like at the max at around 25, 27 cases per 100,000 in the county. You see this adds about 3.5 cases per 100,000, but it is significant. Again, that's at about the 95th percentile of cases in the fall. I should note the caveat on this is before the variant was prevalent in Michigan. So we really can't assess what happens when you have a much greater spreading variant. This is for hybrid, and you can see kind of between like 23 and 27 cases per 100,000. If you're back hybrid, it seems to matter for COVID spread. And here it is when we look at the proportion of kids who are taking up the offer to be in each of these modalities. So the green is in person, the dark blue is hybrid. And what you can see is, and this is when you're at the 25th percentile of the existing COVID spread in the community. So this is when you're around, here, basically. And you can see there doesn't seem to be a significant, this is, you cut the data pretty thin here, I should say. So we're looking at the coefficients as well as the error bars, which is the 95th percentile range. And you can see, it looks like as you go up in the proportion of kids taking up the offer to be in person, you see an increase in the likelihood of cases per 100,000 happening as associated. The most interesting thing here, though, is when you're at the lower levels So, fewer than 25% of kids are actually taking up the offer to be in person, and you're at low rates of county spread in the counties, code spread in the counties around you, you actually might have a mitigating effect of kids being back in school in person. We think that might happen because of the counterfactual. What are kids doing if they are not in school? Here you see it if you're at the 50th percentile. Again, the direction of the effects is pretty clear, although not significant. And here is that if you're at the 75th percentile of COVID spread in surrounding communities in the fall. So our takeaway here is that community COVID rates are positively correlated with in-person and hybrid forms of schooling in naive regression models like the ones that I didn't show you, but if you just ran a correlation between COVID spread and in-person modality, you would see a pretty steep, at a 0.4 correlation. But when you're controlling for all the other factors that we talked about, this kind of goes away until you get to pretty high levels of pre-existing community spread. Our takeaway, everyone wanted us to say, like, is there a number where you should just stop kids being back in school? And we don't feel comfortable giving that number. And our reason is we can't measure for things like mitigation strategies in schools. There is some new research coming out actually yesterday that suggests that if schools are very good about mitigation strategies, we don't see the same correlation and the same causation happening with kids spreading COVID in schools. And so we feel good about that. These were all before the vaccines. So now that we have vaccines and teachers are, according to MEA, 90% vaccinated, you would imagine a lot less spread happening from kids in schools into the community. So with that, I will see if there's any questions. I have not been watching the chat. I'm going to stop sharing. 11 comments.
2 questions that showed up in the chat. We've had a little bit of chatter back and forth on them. One is, are there hypotheses as to the reason for the observed relationships between student economic disadvantage and likelihood of choosing remote over in-person learning, even when it's offered? And some people talked about ventilation and stuff like that. I don't know if you have more to add.
Yeah, I haven't read the chat. So I think that is a big thing. I think many of the districts that have more economically disadvantaged students also have less up-to-date building infrastructure, including HVAC, ventilation. These are also the communities that were the hardest hit by COVID, especially over the summer and into the fall. So, the rates of COVID were much higher in the Detroits and in the Flints of the state. And so I think there's maybe a lot less, maybe some actually well-founded concerns among the parents and the families in those communities that it was much less safe to be. We did try to look at that in the paper that I just talked about, the last piece, and we didn't have the variability in the data to be able to do that. The other point that I think is important is, we have had an equity issue in the state in terms of getting health services to people in communities that get affected by COVID. And so it may be that there's just a greater amount of fear in those communities about what happens if their kids do go back and they get COVID themselves, or they bring it home to their families.
And that actually was the second question that followed up on that was, do we think the health inequities are paying a difference in their choices in the modality, which you just kind of addressed?
Yeah, I mean, we have no good data on that. There is a national study that just came out that does sort of talk about that, but we have no good data from Michigan to talk about that. So that's kind of all a hypothesis, but yeah.
Okay, there was a number of comments in the chat. I don't know if people have questions. They can either unmute or they can type it in the chat. We still have about 5 minutes.
Professor Strunk, this is Joe Musel. I have a question. Thank you for your scholarship and presenting today. I really appreciate that. I made a comment too that Michigan State has several medical schools. You have epidemiologists, virologists, and a $3.4 billion endowment. And K-12 schools that are in person don't have those resources. So is it possible that Michigan State could have opened with all the resources and deep pockets that you have, given the mixed messages we have had over the last 12 months about in-person instruction? So
yeah. I don't have a good answer to that. Not just because I'm at MSU, but because I think it's a really complicated question. I think, we as a university university students are of an age where we know this from science, that kids between the age of 18 and 22 are much higher risk taker than the average population. And I think we see that around the country. There's been some data that towns with colleges in them have much higher rates of COVID. So I think if you're trying to be as safe as possible for the surrounding community, I think MSU was trying to make a responsible decision, both for its own students and faculty and staff, but also for the East Lansing community at large. Do I think that MSU, I would love to see MSU getting active in thinking about how to help school districts around the state to accelerate learning as we go forward, though. I think that's would be a really key role for the university.
Thank you.
There is a comment in the chat thanking you for the data and saying the issues are complex. The information is useful, both for policy developers and school leaders as we think about planning for next year.
Good, we're hoping so. And all of this is on our website at Epic. And so you should feel free to always take a look and an email if you have questions. I'm more than happy to chat with anyone about what we're learning and what we can help with. So please feel free to reach out.
Thank you. Did anyone else have a question? We have about a minute or two left.
Hey, Kathy, it's Steven Saint. One quick question, if I may. So I know that in-person learning is the thing, right? It's like, hey, get kids in classrooms, da, 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 da. And I think next year will look pretty different from this current school year. And yet, I think in large measure highlighted by the data that you just presented, we still will have some learners whose families will choose to keep them in online schools. If you remember the governor's plan she produced a couple of days ago, if we don't get to that 70% high vaccination rate, families will still have children learn online. What do you think the implications are, or what should be our focus to continuing to promote quality instruction for students who are going to remain online? My fear is that all of the energy will focus towards the in-person learning, and then, oh yeah, those kids online too. Like what should we be doing or thinking about now to ensuring that those kids have a great education, even though they're continuing online?
Yeah, I think there's like a hierarchy of needs. I think that's a really, really important point. I do think that there will be kids in the fall learning online. So the first thing is internet access. If they don't have it, they can't interact, one-on-one or in groups with their instructors and other students. So we need to make sure they have good working computers, internet access, and safe places to learn. So if they're not going to be in school buildings, can they be at home? If they can't be at home, where can they be where they can be learning safely and in a comfortable situation? The second piece, I think, is, teachers are not trained to do this, and we threw them into this, and they're exhausted. So I think the idea of giving them more PD right now is a hard one. That being said, I think teachers are able to do this better now and are now at the place where they could be thinking about how do we do this, the best practices. MSU does have a MOOC that they have put together for this, but I think there are best practices in how to teach remotely. And I think the more we can help teachers learn that are going to be working with kids online in time for the fall will be critical. So being able to pay teachers to learn over the summer would be, I think, a really nice start, so they can think about how do we develop our courses that we're used to doing in person. How do we make them even better online? How do we flip the classroom? How do we keep students engaged? What are the tactics we can use that we didn't have time to learn before this past year, but we should have time to learn before next fall?
Thank you. And there was one last quick question, which was, is there any research addressing the impact of consistency in learning mode on student learning?
Not yet. We're going to hope to do it. But there was a study just out of Ohio a few weeks ago that does show pretty clearly that kids that were learning remotely learned a lot less this year than kids who have been learning in person. So there's at least that. And you would think that would have been obvious for a while, but that's actually the first good study I've seen out that shows that pretty definitively using the data from this school year. So I think the next thing to do is think about how we can learn more about the time, if they're switching back and forth and if that's creating disruptions for kids.
Thank you very much. This was fascinating data and research. We really appreciate you coming and sharing it with us. I know that our membership will look through those charts and graphs. They are posted in our resource site. And there was a lot to learn, and there'll be more to learn.
Yes, and always, again, feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for having me.
Yep, thank you very much. We appreciate it. And I do want to remind our membership, please feel free to add some ideas